everybody. We'll make a start. It's a great pleasure today to have James with us here, James Ruddy. And for you who are a master student, a year ago he would have been in your place. And this is what happens, he has to come back and speak to you. So James graduated from the Risk Masters recently. He actually underdid his vocational dissertation with Newcastle City Council, and then he's ended up now working with them. So it's really nice. I think maybe a different one of your team might have come back, but in light of kind of work commitments, we've actually got James. So it's brilliant he's here. He's going to talk about what he does really in your day job now. But if there are questions at the end, people maybe want to ask him, then we'll round those up at the end as well.
Thank you, Louise. Right, I'm going to skip to my opening slide because it's got gifts, so you can tell I'm still young. But I work as I work as a resilience planning and continuity officer for Newcastle City Council. There's a team of 5 of us, and basically our job, anything that has the ability to interrupt the business continuity of the city of Newcastle, we have to plan for, mitigate and try and prevent. So that includes, well, in this case, blackouts, but utility failure, severe weather, flooding. We also do quite a bit of work on modern day slavery as well. But today we're going to talk about blackouts. Who here has experienced a blackout before? Quite a few of you. And note my terminology, you never suffer a blackout, you experience a blackout. Blackouts happen. No.
These are some of James' fellow students who are now coming to listen to it.
Blackouts happen for a range of reasons. You can have the typical workmen accidentally digging up your power cable and the power in your street goes off or the power at your house goes off. This is the copy of the Northern PowerGrid blackout awareness map. This basically shows all the incidents across their grid at any one time, and almost all of these are small localized failures. You also get sometimes very large scale blackouts. For example, when India experienced their blackout in 2012, 600 million people were off the grid at the time, meaning effectively 1/6 of the world population was without power. You also get blackouts in grids that were not well developed, well updated. So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican grid was so poorly maintained it basically fell over like matchsticks. They were still running on oil, which is an incredibly inefficient way to generate power. And they still haven't solved the issue fully yet. And then sometimes you get blackouts due to rather comical reasons. This took the grid out for 15 minutes. It wasn't long, and the monkey did actually survive. But we're not going to talk about these blackouts today because we're not talking about localized failures, and we're not going to talk about failures of grids that aren't considered reliable. We're here to talk about the failures in electrical grids that are considered secure and reliable, and therefore failure is not a contingency that everyone should have to plan for. But we plan for it anyway. But we have to go across a few basics in order to get everyone on the same page. The fundamentals of electrical generation take 4 stages. You have your generating station, the transmission network, which carries electricity up and down whichever country it's in at high voltages. Then you have the distribution network operators that distribute the energy out to businesses, homes, whatever. There's also the 4th stage, which is you as consumers. In the UK, this looks a bit like this. So Sellafield, quite a famous power generating station. Not my favourite. My favourite is Drax Power in Yorkshire because it's really big. And then National Grid, they run the national electrical distribution network that takes power at high voltages up and down the country. That runs at 400 kilovolts. In Scotland, it runs at 138. And then in the north, we have Northern PowerGrid, Western Power Distribution, SSE Power Distribution. In the UK, it looks a bit like that. So these are the DNO areas. So National Grid covers the whole country in terms of transmitting energy, but in terms of actually distributing it out to everyone, these are the companies responsible. And we can see that Scottish and Southern Energy has the top of Scotland because the grid there is quite distinctly different in terms of geography. In terms of how it actually looks, this is the map currently, the latest one based on, I think, May 2017. As we can see, power stations are located throughout the country. They differ by mix, so obviously Scotland with its terrain is predominantly hydro. You have a lot of nuclear power stations towards the coast, and then take note of the fact that if you look at the legend, if you can see it clearly, I'm not sure how clear it is from the back, there aren't that many coal power stations anymore, which is interesting. In terms of having a large interconnected system, you have to have security, and one of the important things about security is the maintenance of frequency and voltage. So frequency is the rate at which a current changes direction within an electrical grid. In the UK it's 50 Hertz, in the USA it's 60. When you get generation that exceeds consumption, you'll get a high frequency, and that can cause damage to generating equipment. When you get too much oh god, I've got lost, sorry. When you get low frequency, you'll get load shedding on the part of the grid to avoid a system collapse. Voltage is the pressure at which a current is pushed around a grid. You need to avoid voltage collapse, but the important point about voltage is that if you go above certain amounts of voltage, you can have parts of the grid operating outside of your voltage stability limits and thermal stability limits. So essentially, if a large transmission cable gets too hot, it will begin to sag. If too much voltage is pushed down a transmission cable, it will actually possibly arc, so the electricity will jump over it. Now, as a result of this, within many parts of the electrical transmission equipment, it will trip itself offline. That's a very pertinent point when we talk about electricity, is that there are many trip points along the grid in order to stop electrical equipment being damaged. It is much better to restart a grid with all your equipment intact. If your equipment is damaged because it's insecure and unsafe, then you're already on the back foot when you're trying to restart a grid. In terms of how we consume our energy, this is a profile since 1960 onwards. As we can see, renewable energy has obviously increased quite a bit recently. Gas has increased, but at the same time, coal has begun to decrease as a share. So we've gone from a picture back in the 1960s where our electrical generation mainly came from coal as its predominant source. Now it's a mix of generation. This is roughly a sausage machine chart of where it all goes. And so you can take a look. So in terms of natural gas is our main source of energy at the moment, and that is because the price of coal has been pushed up by taxation and carbon levies. Nuclear, and then we've got a mix of all different forms of energy. Now, why do we cover this? Well, essentially, the National Risk Assessment is published by the government, and that has power failure under H41 and H45 written in it. Now, that as a document itself provides the assessment of risks and their common consequences to all the relevant parties. It's produced by CCS down in central government and updated every 2 years. It contains detailed risk and planning assumptions that form the foundation of risk management in the UK. Now, there are 85 risks in the NRA, around 45 hazards, the rest are threats. It's quite a big document, and that sets the tone in terms of what is meant to be planned for. Now, within the publicly accessible version of the NRA, this is it. You have the list of things that we're looking at the most. So at the very top we've got pandemic flu, then we've got severe winter weather, and then you have below that solar storms, hazmat incidents, industrial accident. Then moving over, there we can see failure of the National Electrical Transmission Network, H41. And this works on the basis of impact and then likelihood. Everything in the top 8 has to be planned for in more detail by the relevant planning authorities. Everything else you can more or less do with common consequence planning assumptions. Pandemic flu is probably one of the most interesting, and given the current state of Aussie flu in the UK, it's probably quite relevant. The planning assumptions for that are quite concerning. Why do local authorities have a look at this? Well, back in 2000-2001, the UK was hit by quite a few incidents that pushed the sort of ability of legislation to cover them. So we had foot and mouth, we had severe flooding, and then we also had the fuel strikes, and that caused quite a bit of concern amongst the relevant authorities. And that led to the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, and that replaced the legislation of the Civil Defence Act in 1948, which required local authorities to plan for the event of war. Obviously, war is less likely, but civil contingencies still occur. It provides the framework for emergency planning and response. We classify an emergency as anything that threatens the human welfare or environment of the UK, and it creates the duty on us to assess, plan and advise and attempt to mitigate anything that comes under the definition of as emergency. What's not covered on there is that it also creates the categories of Category 1 and Category 2 amongst relevant responders. So in any incident that is considered under the Civil Contingencies Act, a Category 1 responder should be at the forefront of dealing with it. So if, for example, a large bomb went off, the police and the fire service would be at the forefront of tackling that, but then the clean-up after that, once they've signed over the incident, would fall to the local authority. So local authorities take care of the getting back to normal stage of that. Now, in terms of what that means for blackouts, this is it. This is the juicy bit. We plan for 2 scenarios in the NRA. The first one is H41 Infrastructure, or the system failure of the National Electrical Transmission System. And that is, I'll read from the slide, a total national blackout due to the loss of the GB National Electrical Transmission System caused by damage to or technical failure of the transmission network. That's a 1 in 200 year event based on probability, not precedent. It's never happened in the UK before, though it has happened abroad. We'll go over some of the more detailed assumptions later, but if that were to occur, the economic cost is calculated as value of lost load, and that comes to £79 billion. On a smaller scale, we have H45, which is regional electrical failure, a significant failure of the electrical network across one or more regions of Great Britain, affecting large numbers of customers, approximately 1 million, for up to 24 hours and some periods 72 hours. The time is less because you can power up an outsynced grid from the rest of your network if possible. The vol for that is 725 million, which I think is a bit dubious because it doesn't come anything close to 79 billion, but it is what it is. But why now are we looking at this? Well, we essentially have the issue of increased or decreased resilience to weather. We have an increased militia threat landscape, and then we have decreased resilience as a result of the changing generational mix of the UK. So in terms of weather is often cited as being the most plausible way for the grid to suffer a failure. That manifests itself normally in wind damage to the National Electrical Transmission System. You may also get flooding in certain substations that may trip large parts of the grid offline. You also have space weather, geomagnetically induced current, which is very interesting. It's not so much of an issue in the UK because our grid's quite small, But on grids where there are large, long power lines spanning across hundreds of miles, if you have them running at 400 kilovolts, and then suddenly because of a solar storm, that goes up to 600, 700, and they can't take the load, they'll trip. If you blow up a transformer, which is one of the key parts of the electrical infrastructure, then you're basically stuck because they're massive bits of equipment that take around 2 months to replace. Someone did an exercise, I think Lloyd's did the exercise, where they simulated the 1859 Carrion event. I was going to say Carillion. Carrion solar storm, and it basically tripped most of the North American power grid offline. It's not an issue in the UK, although it is covered under a planning assumption, H56, in the National Risk Assessment, and that involves the tripping of 2 coastal substations that would cause some level of discomfort for a while, but we could probably reroute around it. In terms of examples of weather causing power failure, Lancaster is the best one we have to date. Lancaster has kind of been the fall guy because the lessons learned from that kind of elucidate what would happen when you had a power failure affecting a large settlement. Lancaster was basically at the end of a valley. It was at the end of a distribution network, and the power entered the city via a substation. The substation was located on the site of the old city power station, and as the national grid began to take shape from the 1920s onwards, it was the 1926 Power Act that created a rudimentary 138 kilovolt national grid. The need for power stations in individual locations became less. As a result, that shifted the risk of power failure from power stations and shifted it onto a national level. Lancaster's power station was next to the River Lune, and on the night of Storm Desmond in 2015, the River Lune recorded the highest ever peak flow of a river in England. Now, by 10:39, the river level was so high that a joint decision was made by the emergency services to shut down the electrical substation. As a result, they cut off the power to around 60,000 people in Lancaster. The decision was vindicated because the power station, the substation then flooded. As a result of this, Lancaster was cut off, the river level receded, and the effort was made to reconfigure it, and they managed to get it back up for 30 minutes, but then the bus bar, the central point in the substation that fed the city, then collapsed due to water ingress, and Lancaster was cut off for about 2 to 3 days. As I said, it's the best example of a large blackout to impact a developed city in recent times. And some of the lessons will be elucidated later, because how people coped when the power went off. Was there law and order? Did everything go okay? The lessons from Lancaster helped kind of shape that picture. Italy's blackout was partly caused by weather. The Italian grid in 2003 was operating within its N1 security limit. N1 is the principle that a grid can take an event and still operate. It can take one catastrophic event and still operate and continue to be secure and reliable. Essentially, Italy at the time, due to a price discrepancy, was importing electricity from the rest of the European network. So power was flowing over the Swiss border into northern Italy, and it had 2 380 kilovolt lines. One of these lines, due to weather, hit a tree and tripped. Its safety devices tripped the line off grid. Now, that in itself overloaded the remaining lines because power will flow through the path of least resistance, especially in an interconnected network. It fell onto the neighbouring Sil-Soaza line, which was now operating under 110% of its operational limits and was then outside of its thermal stability limit. As a result of that, technically it could have withstanded it for 15 minutes. It withstood it for 24, then that collapsed. And once that happened, the power spread around the remaining lower voltage lines that fed into Italy, and they all began to trip. Italy then became a power island, but because it was importing power in the first place, it did not have enough generation to support its load. And as a result, it went black. 32 thermal generation sets began the process of going into in-house operation, which meant that they would work, but they wouldn't be part of the grid. 8 were successful, and they were crucial in the restoration process for the Italian grid. Here's a picture of what happened on a time basis. So the Metla-Navago line tripped first, and then Silso and then it basically went round as if it was being disconnected. Once that happened, the Italian grid went black. You had 8 gen sets. They began the process, as will be spoken about later, of forming Blackstart islands. When you restart a grid, once you've established that it's dead, you form a power island. You then connect it to another power island. You then make sure that connection is safe and secure, and then you begin expanding it. Italy did that textbook-wise and began to repower itself from north to south. Although this happened at 3 o'clock in the morning, they were having essentially the Blanche Nuit, which was a festival of night, meaning that even though it was 3 o'clock in the morning, there were lots of people still awake. And even though power went off and people were trapped in trains and whatnot, nobody died, which is good. A more recent example of a Blackstart power failure, however, would be Western Australia in 2016. I've got confused. Not Western Australia, South Australia was caused by a weather failure. South Australia is characterised as a grid with a higher than normal amount of asynchronous generators. That basically means wind power. An asynchronous generator cannot, at the start of a restoration, attune itself to 50 hertz. It also needs power in order to restart. But basically, a 1 in 50 year weather event. There are tornadoes across the state. Almost simultaneously, one power line was damaged at the same time, 170 miles apart. This tripped it out of service. This led to voltage instability across the state. The protective measures within 9 wind farms reduced their voltage to protect themselves from voltage instability, and as a result they lost quite a bit of their generating capacity. This meant that that power that was required by South Australia came in through the Hayward interconnector in Victoria. That couldn't take the load, so that then tripped offline. Once that happened, there was no going back, and without the power to power itself, the rest of the grid in South Australia tripped offline, and it fell into a black grid. Now, AEMO admits itself that its wind turbines couldn't have played any role in the restoration. What happened is that once they declared the black grid and made sure that all the necessary parts of the grid that were damaged were isolated and made safe, they began the process of repowering the grid. So they used power from the Hayward interconnector, and they used contracted Blackstart generation in their gas turbines, and then once they were up and running, they began to reconnect the wind turbines and make the grid stable again. Weather's one side of the landscape, but then militia threatened as well. Purely theoretically speaking, if somebody launched an RPG at a main power cable, it would come down, and that would cause quite a bit of trouble. But we're in a scenario now where cybercrime and cyber warfare present an issue for certain grids around the world. I must make the point that Northern Power Grid, National Grid, CTS, government are antiseptic about cybercrime and cyber warfare, so there are multiple defences in place, and often the actual protocols inside electrical networks are split, so the customer facing side of it and the actual operational side are different. In the one grid that is the most notorious example, Ukraine, that wasn't the case. They're planned for under specific threat scenarios as well, so you get cyber attack on banking, you get cyber attack on gas infrastructure, water infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, So the plans are there and the mitigations are in place. Ukraine's probably the best example of a grid being attacked by a cyber attack. I say 2015 there, it happened multiple times. Can't say where they're coming from, but you can take a good guess. One of the interesting things about the first cyber attack is that the malware was in the system for 6 months before it was actually executed. They used kill disk and something. But, think about it like this. 10 years ago, the idea that one state would try and take down another state's infrastructure was unheard of. And now it happens almost every day. People are attacking each other. It's one big free-for-all, essentially. Stuxnet, used by the Americans, was put into the Iranian nuclear centrifuges and managed to spin them just a little bit out of time. As a result, they basically span too quickly and blew up. The Americans took down part of the Ukrainian nuclear program with a virus. So the threat is there. The threat is getting worse, but also so are the defences. As I said, people are antiseptic about cybersecurity. But that being said, if it can take down a distribution network, which it did in the Ukrainian grid, it causes a lot of problems. So, say in a worst case scenario, the grid has come down, what is the process of getting it back up again? And that's called a Blackstart. The procedure to re-energise the GB electrical network in a timely and organised manner following a full or partial shutdown. Essentially, if you go to the bottom of this slide, this, like I said, involves the creation of power islands. You create a skeleton grid, you flesh it out, and then you aim to reconnect load to generation. Now, this has to be declared by National Grid, and once they basically have to say, all right guys, the system is dead, we need to we need to restart. So they will declare a black system, and that will follow local joint restoration plans. That they are pre-planned, but if you had a black start that was the result of a major weather event taking down one of the key high voltage lines, a set plan that involved using that high voltage line would then be moot. So there are many different pathways. So although the restoration process is planned, how it looks on the day would be a question of the status of the system, and therefore it's effectively random. Nobody gets prioritised. The priority is making sure the grid is stable and able to take load again. And that's also a question of generation. Because, as we're going to see in a second, we don't have as much black start capacity as we previously did. You need a black start genset, obviously, and that has to happen within 2 hours. Now, on our current planning assumption, to get a full restoration of the UK electrical grid, in the wake of a black start scenario, you're looking at 3 to 5 days, with the potential for 14 days of load shedding. Load shedding is where you power someone, but then because you don't have enough power for everyone, you take that power away and give it to someone else. It happens in some electrical systems around the world where it's not reliable, but it would be controlled. The 3 to 5 days is also an extension. So it used to be 24 hours to 3 days, and now it's 5 days. So the actual window for full restoration of the grid has gone up. And one of the problems that we have is that although we have interconnections to the continent and to Ireland, we have to maintain our frequency as an island. It's very easy, if you black start, to borrow power from elsewhere. Italy did it, South Australia did it. We have to be able to become self-sufficient because we are an island. So one of the important things here is that a black start enabled generator will normally be coal, gas, oil, nuclear, hydro. Wind power is good, but wind power cannot play a opening role in the restoration of power to the country. Normally it's coal, increasingly so it's gas and oil as well. Nuclear is a synchronous form of generation, but once you trip a nuclear station offline, it takes between 48 hours and 72 hours to get it back on the grid. Then hydro, but we are limited to the degree that the topography of the UK doesn't allow that much hydro power. So we've got wind, we've got solar, they're useful, but they can't play a role. If you think back to one of the slides at the start, 30 years ago, if you imagine a lot of our power was coal, you could have 90% of your stations able to Blackstart. And just to clarify, a Blackstart enabled generator is a generator that can start itself with no external power input. So basically, in essence, a diesel generator will be started and that will power up another generator and then power up the main one, and that will get going. Obviously, because wind needs power in itself to start working as an inverter generator, that cannot do that. So essentially, you'll be black starting with coal, gas, oil, or hydro. You won't be using nuclear, you won't be using wind, and you won't be using solar. So you'll be trying to power up the network initially with around 60%. The likelihood of this happening, now, although we're talking about this, a wide-scale national failure of the grid is unlikely. Possible, yes, but unlikely. Technical failure, unlikely. Several control mechanisms exist. For example, in 2007, 2 large power stations in the UK tripped offline within close to each other, and then load control managed to keep the frequency the same. However, we know in theory that if you get a multiple loss of transmission circuits, you would have a system-wide trip. Circuits take 1 minute to be restored to service automatically. Therefore, if you had a large enough number of circuits tripping at the same time, then you get a shutdown. If weather or malicious threat was actually able to do that is another question. In terms of the impact we plan for, the government guidance is essentially £79 billion of lost load on the economy, the assumption of 1,000 fatalities at a cost of 1.8 billion, and 5,000 casualties at a cost of 275 million. There will be impacts across the board. Just think about how much power has percolated into your everyday lives. We all use it. We probably couldn't do very well without it. You'd have severe transport problems, utilities, telecoms, public order, psychological disruption in getting to business as usual scenarios once again. As a side note, in heat waves, we often see quite heavy loss of life through people who are frail and elderly dying. That is that figure mostly. It's not the naturally resilient who would be dying, but still, that's a big number and it's concerning. Think about it. Blackouts kill. Loss of power leads to death, and it's quite sobering thought. So what we know, obviously I come from Newcastle, so I can use my city as the example. It's never before occurred in the UK. The government has key assumptions to this scenario. A lot of organisations have key assumptions for this scenario in terms of what they do. We know that they will not all be achievable. We also know that if you're stretching it to the 5-day period with 14 days of load shedding, then some of those assumptions will probably not work either. So taking a little bit more of an in-depth look. Transport. That's Newcastle Airport Control Tower. Looks very nice. Aviation, due to the safety critical nature of it as a sector, is probably the most resilient. The airport has backup generators across the site. There are backup generators in the tower. There is UPS on almost all key systems. NATS has UPS in most of their control centres. Actually, no, that's not true. They have UPS and backup generation in all of their control centres. However, it's very likely that UK airspace would be closed in a 3 to 5 day scenario, because it's safer to keep an aircraft on the ground than to have it in the air. Newcastle upon Tyne has a metro system to help people get around. That has no backup power in it. It would be impossible. It's basically an entire railway kit. There's no way you'd be able to power it. The trains have UPS power for 3 hours. However, not enough UPS power to move them. So if you had to shut down that transport network, it would be a case of using that 3 hours of UPS to get people off the network, out of it, and then shutting it down. A shutdown occurred about 2 months ago because the system is bunkered in South Gosforth. They suffered a configuration failure in one of their transformers, meaning no trains could be shunted out. And it was interesting that day because the taxi service in the city of Newcastle became overwhelmed by the load that was being put on it, because this infrastructure that people normally use was no longer operational. The East Coast Main Line runs through the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. Most of the long distance trains are electric, so that's a no-no. If signalling can work, then you could technically possibly run some diesel trains through it. However, you wouldn't be running them with people on them in most circumstances. If you had to move bunkered fuel up and down the country, for example, it could potentially be used for that, but we're still not fully certain. In terms of the road network, here's where blackout planning gets a bit interesting. That's a map of the Tyne Tunnel. Obviously, that would not work because it requires ventilation systems. There is no backup generation on that, and therefore you've lost one of your main routes across the River Tyne. People wishing to travel would then go west into the city, and that would put a lot of pressure over the 3 main bridges that take heavy traffic. The smart motorway network that now is quite prevalent across the country, that would fail. You would lose traffic lights, you would lose CCTV cameras. The CCTV cameras would send a signal to the control room saying we're not working anymore, but apart from that, that's all they would do in a power loss scenario. So how will people act? Will people still drive? Don't know. If people do drive, they'll have to be very careful and vigilant. If you can, maybe you could send police officers to key junctions to help usher traffic back and forth. Motorways are probably the most interesting one because motorways aren't that signal heavy, so they technically may fully work, but we're not quite sure. There's an interesting tale from a lady who was in the 2003 New York blackout, and her accounts of how cars went through junctions was quite heartening because people still managed to move around, but they went slower. They paid more due care. Will that work in a country that has a strange dispensation for roundabouts? I'm not too sure. Utilities. So if we look at water, that's Kielder Reservoir there. That's the main reservoir that supplies the city of Newcastle. That's covered under a separate planning assumption for H41, loss of water supply infrastructure. The Water Industry Act provides for failure to supply, and so does the Security and Emergency Measures Directive 1998. Essentially, the theory is if pumped potable water is not available, Northumbrian Water should provide 10 litres of water per person per day. That would rise to 20 litres per person per day 5 days after the declaration of a critical or major incident. Now, whether or not that's possible is another question. Most key pumping sites have backup generation, and in fact, at times when the grid may be experiencing increased load, National Grid may ask pumping sites with lots of backup generation to either remove themselves from the grid and island or to pump power into the grid. These normally have 3 to 5 days of backup generation capacity within them. So pumped water may be possible. Maybe. We're not fully sure. In terms of sewage normally relies on gravity anyway, and there is some backup generation at some pumps. However, in a worst case scenario, and if this was completely removed, you would get a backlog of sewage in the treatment plants. if it got to a point where it could no longer be contained, it would be discharged into the watercourse. In a typical day-to-day scenario, that would involve a hefty fine. However, would that happen? In the case of a complete civil emergency across the country, we're not sure. Northumbrian Water has a vulnerable customer care line that highlights all the vulnerable customers throughout the grid. Now, that 10 litres is provided by bowsers of water. Now, if those bowsers can get to people, that would be great, but that relies on the roads being clear, there being enough fuel in the tanks that take the bowsers. So there are lots of potential stoppage points along the way. In terms of gas, we have 4 separate gas-related hazard assumptions in the NRA, but the main one is H41, which is failure of gas supply infrastructure. The other ones are H1, H2 and H6, and they relate mainly to North Sea gas issues and failure of gas terminals. The main problem with gas is that electrical failure will impact its applicability in the domestic use. So, for example, your cooker may use gas, but it may need electricity to turn on. It may need electricity to actually light the gas flame inside. So, if people can't heat food, you get another problem. And also, on the topic of food, if people lose power to their freezers and you've got, 20 days worth of sausages in there, you're either going to have to, try and eat them. But if you can't heat your food, you can't eat your sausages, and you have to, send it all to waste. So that's the main problem with gas. Communications is the funny one. Communications are going to be the key thing we have to rally around in this, because every single plan for remediation, every single government message to the people, don't panic, stay calm, blah, 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 is reliant on the communications network maintaining some form of actually working. Now, we know that ADSL lines, your typical copper wire line and non-digital lines, are resilient. That is because your typical BT landline is powered from the exchange. The power for that comes from a central terminal, and it doesn't require that much power either. Digital communications are not, and even if you had an ADSL copper line that was connected to a handset, but then you took the handset off, that wouldn't work. So the best case scenario for communication is a good old quality, phone on the wall with a line connected to it. Digital communications would suffer if a phone line uses VoIP, which is voice over internet protocol. That would fail. There are some concerns about the internet. However, if the central servers for the internet are working and your computer has power and you can make a connection, that would work. Mobile phones, they have UPS in them, 20 minutes to 3 hours depending on load. The anticipated load for a power failure scenario is the same as the load on New Year's, the changeover between New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, when everyone phones each other to say Happy New Year. So technically the network won't fall over, but only if it sticks to that. If your mobile phone has charge, obviously that will work, but if you can actually get a call through, maybe not. Moving away from infrastructure, going more into the social side of this, the elderly, the young, and the vulnerable. Obviously, Northern PowerGrid, the DNO, Northumbrian Water, have lists of vulnerable customers. Local authorities also have lists of vulnerable customers, so we anticipate that we would know where anyone that was critically reliant on electricity would be. However, by the virtue of there are 65 million people in this country, some people may drop through the cracks, essentially. Now, the Care Act 2014 has the explicit duty placed on a local authority that in the essence of provide a failure for a care home, we have to look after the people that were in it. Most care homes in the country are privately run now, so in this scenario, if they were unable to look after their people, they would become our responsibility. If care homes had no backup generation, and to my knowledge, none in the city of Newcastle do, we would have to put them somewhere. The plan is, for the acute, they would go to hospital. For anyone that's not, they would be discharged back into their families. However, like so many things in this assumption, can they be discharged back into their families? Can their families get to the care home to take care of them? Do the families know that they need to come and collect their elderly or vulnerable because the communication networks aren't working? Can they get to the care home on the road network? Well, we don't know. Hospitals, however, are the most resilient structures. They either produce their own power or have double backup generation capacity. So in Newcastle, the Royal Victoria Infirmary has a nice juicy gas generator, and it draws some power off the grid. It also has backup diesel generation. Many hospitals are backed, so there is a backup for the backup, and these are bunkered between 3 to 5 days and regularly tested. The Freeman Hospital, that has a gas generator as well. Now, going back to Lancaster, when their power went off, the hospital became the main focal point of the community because it was visibly one of the few large structures that had the ability to take care of people and keep them warm, keep them safe, keep the lights on. Their canteen served the record number of meals it's ever served. There are students charging their phones left, right and centre, and we expect this too. But if we have a massive shedding of vulnerable people into the health network, it's going to come under quite a bit of strain. In terms of finance, there is anecdotal evidence that copper line connected ATMs that connect over the phone will still work. But we'd be moving into a cash society. Once again, card networks wouldn't work. You'd have issues with SWIFT and BACS payments. Although large parts of financial infrastructure have backup generation, the FTSE 100 certainly does, but whether or not trading would be able to go on is a completely different question. The 5-day scenario would put quite a strain on this. We know that in some examples when power goes off, say if a supermarket has a chiller and there's no notice that the power will come on anytime soon, they give away food, which is an ideal scenario. However, public order, imagine if before we got to the point where supermarkets were in the mind to give away food, people began looting. That presents another issue. But if cash transactions still work on the first day, second day, technically should be all right. Cyber hacking onto the financial network is covered under a threat scenario as well, so the failure of that is covered separately, so there is planning for it. But the biggest question that I have is public order. How will people behave? And I don't think behaviour in a complete power failure will be uniform or the same. It will be different in cities to the country. Some people out in the countryside are already incredibly resilient. They have bunkered fuel, they have the ability to power themselves. People in the city tend to be wholly reliant on a utility, and you take that away, how do they act? Are people going to be nice to each other? Is a community spirit going to suddenly erupt and people look after their elderly and the sick? Or is it going to be a free-for-all? And that's the sort of question that you can try and predict, but until this happens, and hopefully it will never happen, you simply don't know. We know some communities are more resilient than others, particularly rural versus urban. Public order may be a very big problem. I suppose the blueprint for public order, worst case scenario, would be the London riots of 2011. Hopefully that won't happen. But if you can't get messages out to the public saying, please stay calm, we're trying to get your power back on, a sense of helplessness may engulf people. We know that public outrage will be quite severe. It doesn't even have to be a national power blackout. It could be quite a large partial blackout that gives the impression all the power is off. And as a result of that, people will be very angry, and they'll place their anger, as they always do, at the government. So that's that. But the game is beginning to change. Towards the future, technology is presenting some quite useful scenarios to how we produce power. Technological advances have begun to make battery storage a viable technology. Typically speaking, power has to be consumed as quick as it is produced, which means there must always be balance within the network. If we can store power at a grid level or an individual level, that may no longer have to be the case. So potentially it could fundamentally change our relationship with electricity. Now, we have typically stored power through hydro storage, so that's you put power in a high reservoir when the power isn't needed, and then if you get an example of when you do need it suddenly, you open the floodgates and it turns the motor and allows a quick release of power back into the grid. The typical answer now is lithium battery storage. It's had a bit of a rough road to maturity. Lithium batteries blowing up. But because of their chemical structure, they are scalable. So now we have Tesla actually helping out grids such as South Australia, which are heavily impacted by non-synchronous generation, and are now potentially able to keep the lights on when even there's no power being produced. And this will work particularly well with grids that are reliant, for example, on wind and solar power. So that's the next step. So essentially, the electricity market in the future that is anticipated is one where it's not just producer and consumer, it's prosumer. You have people with wind turbines in their back garden, you have people with solar panels on their roofs, and they can produce and take power, they can produce and put power into the grid and take power out of the grid. You get smart grids that can balance power in real time on their own without human input. You get the DNOs moving from being distribution network operators to system operators, maintaining a system throughout. But then again, you'll also get the caveat of cyber attacks more common. If a cyber attack, instead of entering at the high network level, which is comprehensively protected, entered at the individual household level, hacking smart grids, for example, smart meters, that could potentially cause quite a bit of problem. So that security needs to be watched very closely. And then obviously the shift from supply side driven to demand side driven. So in summary, large scale electrical failures have occurred but not yet in the GB network. Plausible worst case scenario is planned for, and we always plan for this, and I don't want to get too poetic, but there are lots of bad people out there that will always try and hurt you, but there are also lots of good people out there that try and keep you safe, so don't worry too much. Changing generational mix of the UK, however, makes restoration in the event of a blackout happening a bit more difficult, although we're working on it. The gradual shift in the electrical infrastructure presents challenges, but it also brings opportunities and will make the world possibly a better place. So that's me done for now. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That's fascinating. We're going to do questions.